Welcome to another exciting podcast of Royal Oak Victory Church. We're glad you've joined us. We are a community devoted to God, connected to others, and influencing our world.
Is that safe? I don't even know what that is. Just go slowly. Yeah, go just touch it very slowly. You don't want to come in fast.
If you freak out, don't go fast.
Is it staying on the bottom? Will it crawl up?
No, it won't crawl up.
Help!
Yeah, go like this. It's best to go like this.
You're
and
right
then
above it?
No, well, just go like.
Don't go fast.
Yeah, don't go fast. Don't go fast.
That
Even that
would be
fast.
fast.
Yeah, that's like literally.
Guys!
Like literally go like this. Yeah, literally go like that. Yeah.
It's okay.
Just plant your palm on it.
Is it like a slug? Or a sea cucumber?
I love sea cucumbers. No, I wish it was.
Keep going.
That
Keep
way.
going. This way. You're very close. Oh.
Pretty far away.
You're still pretty far.
No, it's too close! I can't!
Yeah.
Wait, I can eat it after sea urchin. I don't like it. I'm
Okay,
done.
is that an egg? Yeah, that's an egg. That's a hard-boiled egg.
How many enjoyed that? Yeah, it's called the human experiment. And, this morning what I'd like to do is I'd like to conduct a bit of an experiment myself. Is that all right? How many here, and I want you to be honest, how many here, if you think you would respond like the girl did in the video, I want you to lift your hands. Just lift your hands. Okay. Those of you who didn't lift your hands, the Bible has a word for that. It's called lying. And so we'll have some special prayer for you after the service. Because the fact is regardless of who we are, how fearless, courageous we think we might be, our level of anxiety and fear goes way up when we are forced to blindly go in areas where we've never been before. I mean, that's just the way fear works. That it has a way of increasing, intensifying, multiplying when there is a higher level of uncertainty and ignorance. And that's why harmless things, like we saw in the video, harmless things like eggs and toothpicks can all of a sudden turn into lethal monsters. And small bumps in the night that we hear in the night can transform into violent gangs of burglars that are going to break into our house. Pains that we suddenly feel in our chest. All of a sudden it looks like it's a lethal heart attack coming on, when really it was just all the pizza we ate the night before. Right? That is the nature of fear. Fear thrives in an atmosphere of ignorance. And if you don't believe me, just take a look at the picture here. You can see that there's the reverse roles there, right? Fear multiplies and intensifies. I have another picture here. Same thing. Fear has a way of expanding when we don't know what's behind it. It just has a way of causing greater intensity to happen in our lives. And so, of course, we want to try and deal with that in a healthy way, figuring out how to deal with fear in a biblical way. And really, there's only three ways you can deal with fear. The first way is simply to surrender to it. In other words, we just give up, wave the white flag, and allow fear to control and dominate our lives. And there are people who do that. They cave in and surrender at the feet of fear. That's one way. Another way is to run from it. And there are people who do that as well. I mean, they live their lives constantly looking over their shoulder, running from fear. And when fear catches up to them, they get up and run some more, and then run some more, and run some more. And sometimes we run in the oddest places. right? Trying to get away from fear. Maybe a better way to put it is trying to numb our fear. And so some people run into work, they run into busyness, they run into activities, sports, hobbies, movies, social media, habits, addictions. They're running there to try and get away from fear. And of course, that's never the way we're called to deal with it. We never surrender to it. We never run from it. But rather, the healthy way to deal with fear is actually doing just that, deal with it. In other words, make a decision to turn around and face our fears head on. Just face them. And you know, the thing that's so powerful about this last response is because when we do that, when we choose to deal with our fear by facing it head on, it breaks the power that it has over our lives. And so that's what I want to talk about this morning, this whole area of facing our fears. Those of you who've been with us for the past several Sundays now, you know we've been moving in a series called Fearanoia. We began the series by looking at the toxic effect fear has on our lives, and that sometimes without even realizing it, we don't even know it, fear has seeped in, contaminated our lives, because that's the kind of world we live in. We started with that last week. Pastor Dustin preached an awesome message on how to recognize your fear. How many appreciate the message that he shared last week? Yeah. How to be more aware and recognize your fear. And this morning what I want to do is move on. We're going to look at the third part, how to face my fears. And so if you have your Bibles, turn with me to Judges chapter 6. Judges 6, we're going to look at a familiar story. Many of you are familiar with it. It's the story of a man by the name of Gideon. Gideon, and if there was anybody in the Bible who knew what it was like to live under a constant, oppressive, paralyzing barrage of fear, it was him, Gideon. Because at this point in Israel's history, both they were conquered and enslaved. They had been enslaved by one of the cruelest, most ruthless people on the face of the earth. They were called the Midianites. And things were so bad that the Bible says that the Midianites conquered them and had taken over their houses, their lands, their farms, leaving the children of Israel only one recourse. That was to flee to the mountains, hide in the dens and the caves. Not only that, not only did they take their land and their homes, they would come like a swarm of locusts. They would steal their crops, their produce, their cattle, their livestock, until the Bible says that Israel was literally on the verge of starvation. I mean, you talk about fear and phobia and paranoia. That is the state that the children of Israel had been living under for a very long time. And it's in this setting that God comes to a man by the name of Gideon, and he begins to stir him. He calls him to stand up and face his fears. And you know what I love best about this story is that as Gideon responds to the call of God in his life, faces his own fears, in doing so, in facing his own fears, he actually delivers the nation of Israel from the tyranny of the Midianites. And so I want us to pick the story up here in Judges 6:12. It says, "And the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon and said to him, 'The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor.'" And so we see here that Gideon has a divine encounter with God through an angel. That he's threshing wheat in a wine press, if you know the story, at night because he's so afraid to do it in the day. He's in a wine press threshing wheat when all of a sudden an angel appears to him and says, "Gideon, you are a mighty man of valor. The Lord is with you." And you know, although this is a very short verse, there are some powerful principles in this verse when it comes to overcoming fear. And I want to share a few of them with you this morning. And so how many are ready this morning? Okay, turn to the person next to you and tell them, say, you need to face it. Just tell them that. You need to face it. Okay, you know, the first thing when it comes to facing our fear is remember who is with me. Remembering who is with us. And I don't know about you, but I find that I become far more ready, far more able to stand up and face my fears whenever I can take the time to simply stop and remember exactly who is with me. And you know, that's what happened to Gideon here. You see it in the story. It says, "And the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon and said to him, 'The Lord is with..." Who? The Lord is with you. That's what the angel said. The Lord is with you. And notice it doesn't say the Lord is near you. It doesn't say the Lord is for you. It doesn't say the Lord is above you or below you. It says the Lord is with you. The language is far closer, more intimate than that. Gideon, God is with you. And I find that it's far more easier to face fear when I have a deep awareness and assurance that God is with me. Think about it. The God of heaven and earth. The God who spoke the very worlds into existence. The God who says holds the oceans in the palm of his hands. The God who measures the universe between his thumb and his forefinger. The God whom the Bible says is all-knowing, all-powerful. I find I get a far greater dose of courage and assurance when I know that that God is with me. That's what happens to us when God is on our side. And I remember one of the very first times I really had to face one of my biggest fears was years ago. I was around 22 years old. I was serving at a church here in Calgary in the youth and young adult department. And one day the pastor came to me and he said that he was going away on vacations for a week, and he asked me if I would be willing to speak at the youth service while he was gone. Some of you have heard this story. And, without even thinking about it or praying about it, I said, sure, no problem, piece of cake, sign me up. And he did. He put me on the schedule. And, as time passed, the date slowly got nearer and nearer. And it's funny that way, right? We commit ourselves to stuff, and then when the time comes to actually do it, our knees start knocking. And that's what happened to me. As the day got closer, I thought, wow. And, we had a large youth group. We had probably 300-400 youth in our church at that particular time. My knees started knocking. And, the day of the meeting, I was so fearful. I was so full of fear that to preach, because I'd never preached before. And I thought to myself, and you know how you have those fear voices speaking to you. You've never preached before. What makes you think you can preach now? And I'll never forget that afternoon, I cried out to God, and I prayed that he would send a snowstorm. Some of you heard this story. So the meeting would be canceled. They'd cancel it because there's a snowstorm. The only problem was it was in the middle of July. Now, of course, living in Alberta, you could have a snowstorm in the middle of July. How many know what I'm talking about? And so I prayed that God send a snowstorm. Well, you can guess what happened. The snowstorm didn't come. I was forced to go and preach and face my fears. But when I did, God moved in a powerful way. Matter of fact, it was that night I found that maybe I have a bit of a gift of preaching. People actually listened to me. God actually anointed the evening. And, when I think back of that night, I find that the only way I could have done that, face my fear that night, was to realize that God was going with me. He was with me. And the same is true in every area of our lives where we feel dominated and controlled by fear. Whether it's the fear of failure, whether it's the fear of rejection, whether it's the fear of the unknown or confrontation or financial collapse, or whether it's the fear of people, places, and things, we are far more able to face our fears when we can understand, we remember that the God of the universe isn't way up there. He is with me. Amen? I like what God said through the prophet Isaiah about this. He says, don't be afraid. Let's say that together. Don't be afraid. Turn to the person next to you and tell them that. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. How can you not be afraid? He tells us, don't be afraid, for I am with you. Do not be discouraged, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you, and I will hold you up with my victorious right hand. And so that's the first step when it comes to facing our fear. Realize who's with us. He is with us. The God of the universe loves us so much that when it comes time for us to face our fears, we don't face it alone. He's right there facing it with us. That's the first thing. The second thing is to realize what is in me. And some of us haven't realized that. Some of us are 50, 60 years old. We still haven't realized some of the treasures that God has put within us. You know, as some of you know, Clarice and I have a small dog at home by the name of Monkey. And the reason why we call him Monkey is because when he was a little puppy, he looked more like a monkey than a dog. He looked like one of those squirrel monkeys that you see in the zoo. And so we called him Monkey. And you know, the funny thing about him is, as small as he is, and you can see he's pretty small. I mean, we gave him that bone 6 years ago. He's still working on it. We haven't had to feed him for the longest time. Just throw him, where's that bone? You know, as small as Monkey is on the outside, I think he thinks he's like a Great Dane on the inside. You know, because whenever we take him for a walk, he will just casually saunter up to dogs that are 10 times larger than him and not even think about it. You know, his tail will be wagging and he'll want to make friends. You know, he'll be under their feet looking up, want to make a friend. And, you know, I find that even when the dog starts giving him a hard time and growling at him, Monkey will growl back. And he really puts those big dogs in his place. I mean, I can't believe it. We call him a mighty Monkey. And I really think that somehow he thinks he's far bigger on the inside than he is on the outside. And, you know, as I thought about that, I thought, you know, in many ways, that's exactly what God is trying to get us to do. Right? Especially when it comes to facing the whole area of fear. Right? To see ourselves not how we see ourselves. How do you see yourself? Sometimes we see ourselves in such negative ways. You know, we see ourselves as we've been told, maybe by our parents. Maybe we see ourselves as our 8th grade teacher described us to her, like we're stupid, we're dumb. That's how we see ourselves. And yet what God wants us to do is to see ourselves for who we are. I really believe that the only way we'll be able to truly face our fears, our most terrifying things in our life, is to realize, look inside and realize what is there. And of course, that's exactly what happened here to Gideon. You see it here. It says, "And the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon and said to him, 'The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor.'" One translation calls him a mighty man of war. Another one says a brave and valiant warrior. And yet another one describes him as a great and mighty hero. That's the way God saw Gideon, a great and mighty hero. And I can imagine when the angel said that to Gideon, he must have just been wondering, what is going on? Me, a mighty man? He probably thought, no, you got the wrong address. You got the wrong guy. That's the other Gideon who lives 5 wine presses down the road. Because it's sure not me. I'm not that way at all. Matter of fact, he says that very thing. In verse 15, he says, "Oh, my Lord, how can I save Israel? Indeed, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am least in my father's house." Look at those 2 words, weak and least. That's how Gideon described himself, weak and least, weak and least. That when he looked inside himself, he saw himself as being small and little, weak, deficient, broken, lacking, defective, insufficient. That's what he saw. And yet when God looked at Gideon, he says, "You're not that at all. That you are a mighty warrior. You are a valiant hero. That is how I see you, Gideon. Filled with my ability, filled with my strength, filled with possibility and promise." And that's the only way we can effectively face our fears, is to see ourselves how God sees us. And so I don't know how that relates to you. You know, I sure know that I can go through seasons, and sometimes we go through seasons. Some of us have been in seasons for a long time. Seasons when we wrestle with this warped, toxic view of ourselves, right? Defining myself by all the things I can't do. Seeing myself in only negative and critical ways. Reminding myself of all the things I'm not. What a loser I am. What a failure I am. I call it the negative self-talk that goes on in our minds, some of us day after day. You're stupid. You can't do it. You're a failure. You're a mistake. Some of us, that's all we hear. And it pollutes us. It pollutes us. And not only does it pollute us, it robs us, strips us of our courage so that we can do what God has called us to do, stand up and face our fears. And that's why God has to remind us on a fairly regular basis just who we are. That we're not losers, we're not rejects, we're not defects, but rather we are priceless and precious. I want you to think about that. Priceless, precious children of God who are filled with promise and potential, that we are mighty men, mighty women of God. That's how He sees us. And when we see ourselves that way, it's not called pride, it's just a healthy sense of self-awareness. When we see ourselves as God sees us, we can step into fear and say, God is with me, and He's put everything inside of me to deal with this fear right now. That's how we do it. You know, Jesus touched on this very thing in His great discourse on worry and fear. You see it in Matthew 6:25. Look at this. He says, therefore I say to you, do not what? Worry. Do not worry. You know, worry is just fear, dressed up in a different package. Sometimes we make excuses for worry. We say, well, Pastor, you don't understand. The reason why I worry so much is because I come from a long, noble line of worrywarts. My mother was a worrywart. Her mother was a worrywart. Her mother's mother was a worrywart. And that's all we've ever done in my family is we worry. Worry about everything. Worry about the weather. Worry about the economy. Worry about finances. Worry about my marriage. Worry about my kids. Worry about the next thing Donald Trump is going to tweet. We make excuses for worry. What has Jesus said? He says, don't worry. It's a commandment. Don't worry. Don't lean into that thing. Not for a second. You say, well, how do you overcome worry and fear? He tells us in the next verse. He says, look at the birds of the air, for they neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? Are you not of more value than they? In other words, if you want to overcome worry and fear in your life, look up to God and realize just how priceless and precious you are. Just how gifted and graced you are. Just have a revelation of what God has put inside of you, what He thinks about you. And you know, as you see that, it releases greater levels of confidence and strength so you can stand up and face your fear. Are you with me? One person there. Are you with me? Okay, there we go, just checking. And so the first way to face our fears is to remember who's with me. The second thing is to realize what's in me. You know, the third one is to respond to where God leads me. And this is absolutely vital. We respond to where God is leading us, because how many of you notice oftentimes God doesn't lead us where we think or want to go. He doesn't lead us that way, right? Oftentimes God doesn't lead us to the comfortable places, the easy places, but rather oftentimes the leading of God in our lives goes smack dab. It's a path that goes smack dab in the middle of our greatest fear. God leads us right to fear. Of course, you see this all through the Bible. God led Moses from the safety of the wilderness into the fearful furnace of Pharaoh's courts. God led him there. God led David from the still waters, the gentle pastures of looking after the sheep, into a battlefield where he had to go toe-to-toe with the giant called Goliath. Jesus led Peter to step out of the safe, secure confines of the boat and come to him, walking on the storm-tossed sea. And that's just the way it is. Oftentimes, God's leading in our lives will take us straight into the places of our greatest anxieties and fear. It's not a pleasant thought, but it's a biblical truth. And of course, you see the same thing happening in this story. That as soon as God tells Gideon, hey, Gideon, I'm with you. And then he says, and not only am I with you, but I put some real awesome things inside of you. God calls Gideon to step out and do something that was absolutely terrifying for him. What did he ask him to do? You see it here. It says, now it came to pass the same night that the Lord said to Gideon, take your father's young bull, the second bull of 7 years old, and tear down the altar of Baal that your father has. Cut down the wooden image that is beside it. In other words, what God is saying here is that Gideon, your dad, whether you want to admit it or not, your dad is a pagan idol worshiper. He's an Israelite, but he's an idol worshiper. And so what I want you to do is go to his home, take one of his cows, not your cows, take his cow, tear down the idol that's erected in front of his house, and then offer that cow as his cow as a sacrifice to me as an act of worship. How many know it's not an easy request? You know it wasn't easy because it says here that Gideon was so frightened, so afraid, he took 10 of his servants with him, and he went in the middle of the night. Right? That's how afraid he was. And the very next morning, when the men of the city woke up, saw the altar broken down, they asked who did this thing. And when they found out that it was Gideon, they told his dad. They knocked on his dad's door, and he said, bring out your son. He has destroyed the altar of Baal. He must die. Thankfully, his dad stood up and protected him. He wasn't killed. But it shows you just how fearful and terrifying of a place God had called Gideon to step into. And I hate to say it. You know, I wish it was different. But the reality is the same thing is true in our lives. That oftentimes God's leading doesn't take us only to the green pastures, the still waters. It doesn't just guide us along the pleasant, soft, easy, fun, breezy ways of life. That oftentimes God's leading in our lives is straight into our greatest fears, facing our greatest fears. Because God knows that it's only by going there into our fear that we can ever be able to break its hold and dominion over us. God knows that. You know, what I find so interesting about this story is that immediately after Gideon does that, I want you to see this here. I've never seen this before in this story. Immediately after Gideon faces his fear with his own family, he's then anointed and promoted as the leader and deliverer of Israel. You see it in verse 34. It says, then. What does then mean? Then. When is then. When he chose to face his fears, it says, then the Spirit of the Lord took possession of Gideon. He blew his ram horn as a call to arms, and the men came to him. Interesting. In other words, the only way Gideon became qualified to face the far larger fears and challenges in his life was him being willing and obedient to face the much smaller ones at home. Smaller fears at home. You know, when I read that, it really spoke to me. Because just like many of you, I have a desire, I have a passion for God to do larger, grander things in my life. How many here would like to see God do more things in your life? Yeah. More things, bigger things, more favor, more blessing. We all want that. And yet oftentimes the only thing stopping the bigger things is our failure to step into, our reluctance to face the fears that are in front of us right now. In other words, it's only as we're willing and obedient to follow God in those places that we will ever be able to receive a far greater anointing and favor that God wants to place upon our lives. And so with that in mind, I want to ask you a question. I want you to think about one area of fear that you're struggling with right now. What are your fears? What is that fear? Can you name it? Maybe there are some family fears. Sometimes our greatest fear is family fear. Family fear, fear of speaking the truth to your spouse when it comes to your marriage. Wow. You say, I'd rather not do that. I don't want to rock the boat. I'd just rather let sleeping dogs lie. I mean, the last time I mentioned something to my wife, she threw a plate right at me. Is she chasing me around the house with a frying pan? No, it's not that bad. So I better just leave it. Just leave it. Sometimes our greatest fear are family fears, right? Say, I don't want to talk to my teenager about their unhealthy, ungodly lifestyle. What if they get mad? Well, what do they do? Oh, I don't know. I'm kind of afraid to do that. Bring correction. Maybe your biggest fear is setting boundaries and telling your parents or your siblings where they end and where you begin. How many have ever been part of a family like that? You don't know where they end and where you begin. And so Christmas time comes and they're all over at your house. You wanted a quiet Christmas at home with your family. You got the uncles, the aunts, weird Uncle Fred. Say, why do you have that? Because I never said no. And the reason I never said no was because I'm afraid. What are your family? Some of our fears are saying the good things, right? Looking our wife in the eyes and saying, honey, I love you. You're awesome to me. Telling our children how precious they are to us, that we're proud of them. Sometimes those are our greatest fears. Sometimes our greatest fears are just becoming more intimate. Will you pray for me? I'm hurting. Can you lift me up? Family fears. The way I say it is that oftentimes our greatest fears are not way out there somewhere, right, in other countries like Russia or North Korea. But oftentimes our greatest fears are standing right in front of us, right in our own home, and it's there that God is calling us to take a step into them so we can deal with them. Are you with me? And so I want you to think about one of those fears in your life right now, whether it's family, whether it's work, whether it's over a certain issue or person or thing. Face that fear. We'll never be able to break out and into what God has for us until we face it. What I find interesting is that the anointing came on Gideon after he faced his fear. Isn't that interesting? Sometimes we think, God, I need you to anoint me so I can do the fear. I found it interesting that first Gideon faces his family fear, and then God anoints him. And so, some of the things when it comes to facing our fears, remember who's with me. The second thing is realize what's in me. The third is to respond to where God leads me. Lastly is to rely on those around me. And we've all heard the saying that there's safety in numbers. Safety in numbers. Not only is there safety, but there is support and strength. There's inspiration. There's encouragement. There's life. There's grace. Where do you find it? You find it in numbers. And you see that very thing here in the story of Gideon. He blows the trumpet. The anointing comes upon him. He blows the trumpet. And 32,000 men show up for battle. How many think that's a pretty good draft? How many think that's not bad? I'd like to learn how to blow that trumpet. 32,000 men show up for battle, but God doesn't like it. God looks down and he says, there's too many of you. You say, well, why would God do that? Because listen to me. God is more interested in quality than quantity. Did you hear that? Did anybody hear that? Okay. God is more interested in quality than quantity. And so God looks down and God says, no, Gideon, there's too many. I want you to tell all the men who are afraid that they can go home. And so Gideon, a little concerned, he says, okay, God just told me if you're afraid, you don't want to go to battle, you're allowed to go home. And just like a wild stampede of horses, 22,000 of them hit the road. And so Gideon's now, he's left with a whole lot less. He says, God, you shrunk my army. God says, well, I'm going to shrink it even more. There's still, I'm looking for quality, not quantity. And so God says, okay, Gideon, what I want you to do is I want you to have the rest of the men go down to the river, ask them to take a drink, and every man that drinks like a dog, I know who says the Bible's boring? In other words, every man who gets down on his hands and knees and laps water like a dog, tell them they can go home. And I can just see Gideon praying, oh, guys, remember your manners. Remember what your mom taught you. Don't drink like a dog. Well, the thing is they did. A lot of them did. Actually, they all did except for 300. 9,000 of them drank like dogs. There was only 300 left. God shrunk Gideon's army down from 32,000 to a mere 300. You know, if you do the math, that's a reduction of over 99%. You read that and you wonder, what on earth was God doing? Well, I'll tell you, I already said it. God is more interested in quality than quantity. That really spoke to me. Quality relationships rather than the quantity of them. How many of you know we live in a Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat world where relationships are about as deep as an inch? They're an inch deep. An inch deep, a mile wide, right? That's the kind of day in which we live in. And yet the secret to us effectively stepping out, facing our fears, is not dependent upon the number of relationships that we have, but rather the depth and the health those relationships pour into our lives. And that's why I always say that if you really want to know how many Facebook friends you really have, if you really want to know, just post on your wall, "I'm moving this weekend, need help." Find out how many actually show up, right? Those are your friends. Those are your friends. And that's why it's so important that we have people in our lives, quality people in our lives who are there to support us through all the things we face. People who are close to us. People who know us, people who care about us, people who we can share our struggles and our challenges, our hurts, our disappointments, our anxieties and fears with. Do you have people like that in your life? Because that's one of the keys to facing fear effectively. You know, Paul the Apostle, as strong and called and as anointed as he was, he needed that very thing. You know, in 2 Corinthians 7:6, he says, when we arrived in Macedonia, there was no rest for us. We faced conflicts from every direction, battles on the outside and fear on the inside. What we see here is the making of a very bad day. No rest, conflicts coming at them from all directions. Paul says we had battles on the outside, fears on the inside. You wonder, what would Paul do? What would Paul do? How did Paul overcome his fears? Did he just rally himself? Pray an extra prayer? How did Paul deal with his fears when he felt flooded, overcome by them? Well, he tells us in the very next verse. It says, but God, who encourages those who are discouraged, encouraged us by the arrival of Titus. Titus. Who was Titus? He was a dear friend of Paul. He was a person who committed to pray for Paul. They were friends. They were committed to one. It was a deep relationship. That's the kind of place Titus played in Paul's life. And because of it, Paul got filled with fresh courage and strength. That's the place relationships play in our lives. They lift us when we're down. They strengthen us when we're weak. They encourage us when we're disheartened. And they fill us with fresh courage and faith when we are fearful and afraid. And so I want to ask you, do you have relationships, people like that in your life? Because that's one of the key ways we overcome fear. We do it as a team. You know, as many of you know, we had our men's deployment this weekend, 24 hours away with the men. How many men came to the men's deployment? Just grunt. Woo, woo. That's not a very good grunt. Try it again. Woo. That's better. We went to the men's deployment. We just got back last night. What an awesome time, you know. Great fellowship and, teaching. And the theme was share your stories. We had some of the guys get up. Well, that's what the whole theme was. Guys got up and shared their story, a story of breakthrough in their life. It was powerful. But, you know, one thing about men's deployment is there's also activities. And one of the activities I took part in, not all men did, but I did, because I'm a real man. It's called high ropes. How many here have ever done high ropes? Okay. I'm telling you, they don't call them high ropes for nothing. You know, the first part of the high ropes course is you have to crawl up this thing, right? Which is hard. Like, you know, I did it, but I came home a little stiff. But anyway, we crawled up this. But then the next thing, and the guy said, you know, this one is hard to do. The other one's easy, but it'll mess with your mind. And I said, in what way? And he told me, he says, because what you got to do is you got to climb this ladder, then you got to climb up this pole, and then you got to somehow get from that pole, you're standing on a pole. On the pole. And then you could take a flying leap and you touch that buoy. Well, you know, I'm with a bunch of guys. Like, the reason I'm not in this picture, I was taking the picture, but I'm there. And I'm thinking, man, I'm preaching on fear on Sunday. Face your fears. And here I am wimping out. Oh, there's the pastor. All talk, no action, man. So I went up the pole. And I stood there, and I'm on the pole like this. The wind is blowing. And the guy's saying, okay, I'm going to count to 3, and then you jump off. Well, you know, the only way you can do that without splatting on the ground and having a funeral that week is you depend on your team. Look at that. There's the rope, and they hold the rope. And so when you do the flying leap to hit the thing and you're flying off into the middle of nowhere, you have a deep assurance that my team is going to look after me. And I was praying that nobody was just checking their Facebook, you know, let go of the rope. Oh, look at that bird. They held on to the rope. How many were on the rope when I flew? Is there anybody? Yeah, let's give them a hand, man. That's the power of team when it comes to facing your fears. You got someone who's holding you, someone who's supporting you, someone who's lifting you up in prayer. It's so powerful. Of course, in our church, it's a big value. We call it community, the power of community. We celebrate it through what we call connect groups. And so, you know, we would encourage you if you're not part of a connect group, and we have lots of them now. Some of them are just ending, but we still have ongoing ones. We have a connect group every Monday night for men. We have them for women. We have our push group that meets here every Wednesday. Pray until something happens. If you want to learn how to overcome fear, show up to push one night. I'll tell you, they'll push you out of your fear into faith. They are prayer warriors. We got our Friday night Filipino group. I'll tell you, you go there, you'll lose your fear. They're an awesome group, especially the fear of gaining weight, because they'll just feed you so much it won't matter anyway. Have another plate. It's one of my favorite groups. I would encourage you, go to our website and check out some of our awesome groups. But, you know, God is calling us, and I'm going to be wrapping this up. He's calling all of us to face the fear that's in front of us right now. And, of course, you do that. There were those 4 keys, right? You know, you certainly can't surrender to it. You can't run from it. You have to deal with it. And the way you deal with it is remember God's with me, right? You remember, realize what's inside of me. Right? Understand God's leading in my life. And then the last thing, rely on the people around you. That's how you overcome fear.